Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Adam Henze, and I'm here today to talk about my dissertation, Means of Conveyance, Spoken Word Pedagogies, Hip-Hop Literacies, and the Challenges of Fostering Poetry Spaces. I want to say thank you for shining some light on my work through the Outstanding Dissertation Award. I'm very sorry I can't be with you to share it with you in person at the conference, but I was asked to make this video, and I wanted to put something a little bit special for you all in the research community. So I'm going to start this presentation off with a poem. This poem is about the relationship of loving spoken word and hip hop poetry, but also experiencing hearing loss. So if you get a little bit lost in the sounds, then maybe that's okay. If you want to follow along with the poem, the chapter is called Sound Off in my dissertation, which is published in open access through ProQuest if you want to use that as a resource. So here you go. Here is my poem, Sound Off. Sometimes when people are speaking to me, I can only hear their words as a numb rubbing against my temples. Sentences sometimes are reduced to the hard hisses of S's and C's and the pop, pop, pop of P and B sounds, the slight upward lift of teeth and tongue asking a question. Sometimes I smile and nod, hoping what they are saying is something worth smiling and nodding over. Sometimes I bob my head like a banger of a track is playing because I am scared to say in the moment that I cannot hear. Sometimes when I'm on stage speaking a poem of my own, I'll hear a crackle to my left shoulder like the release of obstructed steam, and then muffled notes like a directional microphone is being smothered by someone folding it within a dirty dish towel. There's the feeling of shifting liquid in my ear and pressure like a tough wad of bubblegum tucked in the back of my cheek. Noise gets swallowed like a gulp underwater in that instance, and I hear the same distant tone that movies show when a soldier's helmet has been shell-shocked by a flashbang. Sounds will inevitably sift slowly back into my canals, but only after weeks of feeling the cold sting of ear medicine and the way Q-tips make me cough and tongue the bottom of my jaw. Though I'm a poet, I've never written about my hearing loss before. The way that oral utterances fade in and out of focus in my life has given me a unique relationship to language and music. Perhaps it's why I fell in love with rap and spoken word, because even the times I can only hear the lyrics as blurred notes within the beat, the thumping of the break against the rate of the measure means me and my scarred drums can stay on track. I'm going to stop right there. You can listen to more of that chapter or read more of that chapter if you would like to, but I think this is an interesting segue into why I found spoken word poetry to be more accessible and engaging as a young reader when I really wasn't engaged with the poetry reading that I was doing as a teenager in school. So I made a quick PowerPoint for accessibility purposes that I'm going to pull up here. So forgive my awkward transition as I pull that up. And then I was asked to definitely share some of my poetry. So I will end my presentation with a little bit of that as well. So as I mentioned, my dissertation is called Means of Conveyance, Spoken Word Pedagogy, Hip Hop Literacies, and the Challenges of Fostering Poetry Spaces. And let's get into what this whole spoken word thing is. So spoken word pedagogy is the theory and practice of using poetry that is meant to be spoken aloud as well as written on the page. So hopefully you could hear from my previous example why it might sound a little bit different than some of the poetry you hear in a traditional English lesson plan. This is a photograph of an audience from an event that I hosted at my academic summer camp. As you can see, there's a discrepancy in ages of participants, but most of the participants in the photo are teenagers. They're young writers who love poetry, and teens are the ones who are pushing for this all-high time readership in poetry. Readership of poetry is the highest it's been in decades, largely due to the fact that there are so many new platforms for expression like TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and other social media platforms that teens have really taken a liking to, and they found a way to share their own content. So that's why we're going to situate spoken word pedagogy and hip hop literacies as a youth literacy, because it represents the thing that kids read, consume, listen to in their home, and not necessarily in the classroom. So I wanted to study this, which brought me to my critical questions. So how do collaborative teams of youth poets, teachers, and teaching artists establish sustainable literacy communities? So we're going to break down what some of that stuff means in just a second, but I wanted to also highlight the two critical sub-questions that I had for my dissertation, which is what kinds of gaps exist between students, teachers, and teaching artists. I was curious about this because you could see myself on the left as a poet, and that's one of my students on the far right. That's Jamal Parker, who won Brave New Voices, a large youth competition with his team in Philadelphia a few years ago. I wanted to explore the relationships between students and teachers who are engaged in this art because it was important to me and to students like Jamal. And then finally, how do youth and adults navigate these gaps? And I want to focus on these gaps because in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of literature published about spoken word, but a lot of it is about the benefits, about the positive qualities of poetry and spoken word, but very few research articles talk about the challenges that artists face or the struggles that they face to implement literacy programming. And that's specifically what I wanted to focus on in my dissertation. So I had a lot of participants for my dissertation. I wanted to cast a wide net. I had about 50 different interview participants, and I broke them down into different categories, although they were slightly difficult to pin down. The first is a category that I call teaching artists. So a teaching artist is any type of artists who uses their art form in some kind of teaching or learning capacity. So this might be someone who is a dancer, or they are a choir director, or they might screen print t-shirts and they might be brought into your learning space to teach youth, adults, whoever is the learner in that situation. The second group that I wanted to look at is what I call host teachers. So a host teacher is anyone that hosts a teaching artist in their space. These are teachers or stakeholders in traditional learning communities. And I was curious about how they collaborate with these artists from the community. And most importantly, I wanted to center the voices of students because this is a youth-led poetry movement. And I also have students in parentheses or quotation marks too, because students are hard to break down. Some of my students were youth, teenagers, some of my students were adults. Some students were people I just met in a quick interaction. Some were like lifelong students, long-term students. And then some of my students have gone on to become teaching artists themselves. So a lot of different participants kind of didn't really fit in their category all the time, but that's okay. I want to listen to all of these different stakeholders in these poetry communities. I also visited lots of different sites, and the reason why is because a lot of research seems to try to pin poetry into one classroom or into one group of participants. And that's just not been my experience as a teaching artist and as a researcher. Poetry goes everywhere. I even have a chapter about performing at the Indianapolis 500 in my dissertation, which is an unexpected place where you would find some poetry. So I go everywhere in what I say, from lecture halls to juvenile halls and everywhere in between. Elementary classrooms, secondary classrooms, lecture halls, hip hop venues, coffee shops, parking lots, you name it. There's poetry everywhere, and we look at it in my dissertation. So I could talk a long time about my methods. I wish that I had a little bit more time, but I don't want to take all of your time here today. So I want to talk about 3 quick concepts from my methods. And if you are curious to learn more about poetry and methodology, then please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. So the first concept we get is from Laurel Richardson, who talks about creative analytic practices. So creative analytic practices, or CAP, is any type of research method that employs the creative practices of an artist. So a dancer, a writer, a poet. So anyone who uses poetry as a form of creative analytic practice is practicing what Prendergast calls poetic inquiry. Now, this can take all kinds of different forms. You could take an interview participants' dialogue from a transcript and turn it into a poem. You can write your own poem. I had some participants that I asked them to write a poem in lieu of participating in an interview. So those are some of the different things that I did with poetic inquiry. And I wanted to create a unique brand of poetic inquiry that I call remixed methods that use the processes of hip hop literacy. So this is a hip hop infused version of poetic inquiry. And the individual things that we do are like mixing poems, layering poems, kind of the different hip hop processes if you're into hip hop music. So as you can see, I have an excerpt of a transcript from one of my participants that I call Sophie. She was a camper at Slam Camp, and I turned exchange that we had into a poem called "Because of Slam Camp, I Can Take the Bus Alone." And here's what Sophie had to say. Slam Camp is a whole week-long affirmation of what our worth is. You are talented, you are knowledgeable, you deserve good things. You deserve friendship and love and warmth and food and sleep and everything like that. I literally attribute it to Slam Camp that I get on planes alone because I'm that much more secure. I can take the bus alone. I can take the train alone because even if somebody does look at me weird or catcalls me, I can just keep on walking. I can go straight through it. So hopefully within that poem, you can talk about or understand the relationship building process that poetic activities have between youth and adults. And you can also see some of the challenges that some poets face, not only in finding a poetic oasis like Slam Camp and then having to go back to their traditional learning place where they might not get the same kind of enriched learning, but also just the things that poets deal with, such as sexism, misogyny, racism. A lot of these different things are covered in my dissertation of what poets face in their pursuit of truth. So I wish I could talk more about my findings and the implications, but I just don't have a lot of time. Again, if you reach out to me or have any questions, feel free to read my dissertation or send me an email. I'd love to talk to you more about it. I'm going to end with a short excerpt from a chapter from a unique setting. This was when I did a poetry program in a maximum security women's prison. I was asked to create a summer reading program based on the novel Frankenstein. So you could see me on the PowerPoint hamming it up in my Dr. Frankenstein getup. So this takes place in a poetry classroom, and we are in our English class, and you can see how the theme of Frankenstein emerges in the literature. So this will be a hybrid between prose, and I turned some ethnographic observations into an autoethnographic poem. So before concluding, I just want to say thank you. Mostly thank you for listening to our story. I'm going to end the screen share, and then I'm going to end with this last poem. So you can read the whole chapter in my dissertation. In closing, I'd like to share a poem I've written in some Frankenstein metaphors. The poem comes from a classroom interaction with a student incarcerated in a women's prison. It was the winter semester, and we were all bundled trying to keep warm in the drafty education building. I asked the class to describe the cities they had visited in their lives, and the student responded that she had been incarcerated so long that she could not remember the names of any towns she had been to. The moment struck me and conjured in my mind the same imagery of Promethean bondage that inspired Mary Shelley. For the sake of confidentiality, I changed her name to Justine. This poem's called a pseudo-rondo for a prison classroom. Mittens grip a printed poem, quaking with fall's first shiver. We plunder its body like yeggs cracking at a casket sliver. I mentioned Shelley and boot clomp past the colossal fact. Some bards in class have stuffed parts in a garbage sack. With practiced hands, do we grasp the quill or quiver? Writing time, I'm electrified with a prompt to deliver. But think a city you've seen, retrieve its streets and rivers. Some recall family farms with apple orchards out back, but Justine can't remember the names of places she's been. Chained to rock, waiting for some thunder god to forgive her. As class ends, she considers the multiple meanings of trigger, an after-hours bar, a flourishing gurgle in my track. I can't stop pondering while Old Crow chews my liver. The Justine can't remember the names of places she's been. Thank you all so much. I hope to see you next year at AERA.